My name is Dana Kelly. I have served as the Executive Director of NAGC since 2019. And I wanted to spend a few minutes today addressing something that is particularly frustrating for a lot of family historians: inconsistent spelling in records. Now, we have all been there. We can't find a farm, a parish, an ancestor in an index or in a record because the spelling isn't what we expected it to be. So I hope to spend some time today just giving a little background on what causes some of this variation, and then some tips that we can use to work around all of those variations. Now, the Norwegian language itself and the history of the evolution of that language contributes a lot to the changes in the variety that we see in spelling. And one of the things that has heavily influenced the development of the Norwegian language is the landscape of Norway. It is incredibly mountainous, which means that there are a lot of communities that are separated from each other by mountains and fjords. And there hasn't been a lot of language exchange throughout most of Norwegian history from one community to the next. If you can't get from one town to another because there aren't good roads, you can't exchange language and ideas and customs. So this created an environment where dialects were really able to flourish. So we have a lot of variation in pronunciation, we have a lot of variation in the meanings of words, and we have a lot of variation in spelling from region to region, simply because they are so separated and secluded from each other. And another thing that has heavily influenced the evolution of Norwegian pronunciation and spelling is the influence of the Danish language. Prior to 1814, Norway was formally ruled by Denmark. So if there was somebody who wanted to go into the clergy in Norway, they had to be educated in Denmark. There weren't any institutes of higher learning in Norway at that time, so they went to Denmark to be educated, and they came back speaking and writing Danish, not necessarily writing Norwegian. So a lot of those records that we're going to be looking at for genealogy were created by the church, and therefore created by people who were writing in Danish, and maybe even in some cases writing in Latin. And then there was also a major surge in the 1800s of nationalism. The Norwegian people wanted their own language, and there were kind of two competing schools of thought around how that written language should evolve. One group of people was really believed that it should be similar to the written Danish. And another group of people strongly believed that it should be not at all influenced by Danish, and it should be more true to the language that was spoken in some of those secluded communities in Western Norway that didn't have any Danish influence, that would be a more quote unquote true Norwegian language. So because of this push and pull between these different groups, we see some difference in the way things were recorded for many, many years. And all of this had a lot of impact on the things that you're going to see in records. You may see things written strictly in Danish. You may see things written in kind of a transition language known as Dano-Norwegian that combines more modern Norwegian with Danish as it was transitioning into Norwegian. And you may see things written in modern Norwegian, and you may see things written in dialect. And since our ancestors left during this period of transition, you are likely to encounter all of those as you're going through different records. And then something that is not necessarily exclusive to Norway, historically in all parts of Europe and in the United States, there just was not a major concern when it comes to consistency of how things were spelled. Our ancestors led really different lives than we do. They didn't have photo ID. They didn't need an ID to vote or to travel. They didn't need to have identification in order to collect welfare like Social Security. They didn't need to worry about the IRS knowing whether or not their name was spelled exactly the same on their tax return as it appears on their birth certificate. They didn't have these documents. They didn't need to worry about things being consistent. And so, since it wasn't a priority, they just simply weren't consistent. And is this something that's maddening to us when we're looking for records? Absolutely. But we just have to get over it. We have to accept that they did not care and they did not ensure that things were spelled the same on their birth certificate as it was on their marriage certificate, as it was on their death certificate. So since we know it's going to be inconsistent, what are we going to do about it? Well, some variations are relatively predictable. And one of the things that actually has, in some ways, made this easier is the proliferation of online searching. Websites like Ancestry.com and FamilySearch.org do not require you to have exact spelling when you do a search. So if you type in Olson with an O-N and hit search, you are going to get results that include Olson with an E-N. And that is definitely helpful when you don't need to think ahead of all the possible spelling variety. And you can also use, when you're doing online searches, use wildcards. So if you type in OLS question mark N, you're going to get results that include ON, and you're going to get results that include EN. And that is certainly helpful and is definitely a time saver. But not all websites offer that as an option. And definitely when you're looking through like a big book that would have a printed index, they're not going to include that type of spelling variety. So you're going to have to be thinking about these differences and the likely differences. So other than the obvious Olson with an EN or an ON, there are some vowel changes that were relatively common, and I'm going to give a few examples here on the next few slides. Well, one of the ones that I wanted to talk about is the letter O, that A with a circle over it. That is a relatively new letter in the Norwegian language. So when we're looking at records prior to 1900, we are not likely to see that. So if you know that your ancestor came from Lordal, say you found that in an obituary, and you're like, oh, okay, we're going to go back and look for Lordal. Back in the 1800s, it was probably spelled with a double A and not that O. And same thing is true with just a single A. Sometimes it was just spelled with a single A rather than a double A. So we have to be kind of flexible in our mind when it comes to the letter O. And sometimes when you're looking for a farm name, like this Gretabeck example here in the center, my ancestors came from this farm. It's in Telemark. And sometimes I find it spelt with just an E. Sometimes I see it spelt with that A, the AE combination letter. Do not overlook something just because it's not spelled exactly the way you thought it would be. If I were to ignore all of the Gretabecs spelled with the AE, I would be losing a lot of records because I was assuming that it wasn't the same place. Those are the same farm. Some other vowel changes are due not necessarily to the letters not existing. It's just difference in pronunciation, different dialects. Leikonger versus legonger. It's just a difference in the way it was pronounced. So as they were spelling it, it's just a different dialect. Same with Kinnevik and Tinnevik. It really is just a difference in how it was spelled, different points in time. They were pronouncing it differently, so they spelled it slightly differently. One that you're likely to encounter quite a bit is oust versus üst. Both of those words mean east. They're spelled differently, they're pronounced differently, but they both mean east. It just, depending on what time period the record was created, what location it was created, you may encounter those different spellings, but they definitely mean the same thing, just something to keep an eye out for. Now, sometimes when you are searching in an online database, you do need to have exact spelling. One website in particular that requires it is norwayparishes.com. You can't use a wildcard. It return similar spellings. If you don't have the exact spelling, you're not going to get any returns on a search. So you will have to manually swap out different letters until you find the one that they're using. Common switches are T's and THs or V's and F's. A lot of farms over time have swapped out those letters. And one letter that I wanted to talk just a little bit more about is the letter Q. In modern Norwegian, they generally do not use that letter unless they're using a foreign language word like quiche or something that would use the letter Q. But there was a point in time where Q's were used in the place of K's when it was followed by a V. So farm names like Kvam, Kvamma, Kvola oftentimes were spelled with a QV instead of a KV. And interestingly, when people immigrated from those farms to this country, a lot of times they chose to spell that name QU as opposed to KV. So if you know somebody whose last name is Quam, Kwame, Quaman, Quali, they probably came from a farm that was spelled with either a QV or a KV. Some other common consonant changes. When you look at the name Eric, sometimes it's spelled with just a K, sometimes a CH, sometimes a CK. We also see that in the name Mikkel, where those hard k sounds are spelled in different ways. W and V, another one that are often swapped back and forth. Again, W is another letter that in modern Norwegian is not used very often. Generally, that has been switched to a V and has always been pronounced the same. Vinja and Vinja here, even though it begins with a W, would still have been pronounced Vinja. And here we have again, we're looking at Leikonger versus Legonger, but this time we're looking at the difference between a K and a G because of the different dialect. And unfortunately, when we're looking at Leikonger and Legonger, we're seeing that it's not only the consonants that have changed, we also have a vowel change. And so that's something else that's important to remember is some words are going to have multiple letter changes over time. And that, of course, doesn't make it any easier when you're trying to search for a place, search for a record, but it is important to keep that in mind. In Vinja, we see the same thing. You've got a J in the first Vinja, and you have an I at the end of the word. So again, those two words have multiple letters that have shifted over time. On the last slide, we saw that Vinja had the J and the I switched. Here we have in the man's name Björn. Sometimes it's spelled with a J, sometimes it's spelled with an I. It's the same name, just a slightly different way of spelling it. Sometimes in Norwegian place names, they will add an EN to the end of it. Very commonly seen in Telemark versus Telemarken. It's probably the most well-recognized addition of EN to a name. It's not a different place, just at different points in time, they treated it differently. The same with Dals. A lot of times you will see an H in a farm name that ends with Dal. Here we have Berdal with an H and Berdal without. You might see it with Lindahl, Rheindal. There's nothing different about those places. It's just different spelling over time. If you're particularly interested in the evolution of how farm names have been spelled throughout history, between the years 1897 and 1924, Professor Olaf Rigg published a series of books called Norske Gårdnavne, and what that means is Norwegian farm names. And it's a multi-volume set where he goes through literally hundreds of farms and illustrates the different spellings as they've been shown on different records throughout history. And it can kind of give you an idea of how the language has evolved over time. We do have copies of those books in print at the Naiseth Library, but if you would like to take a look at some of the farms online, there is a database that is at the link I show here, where you can take a look at his research in a more digital format. So what about spelling changes in records in the United States? If the records were created in Norwegian, they will follow a lot of the same rules as they did in Norway, with different consonants commonly being swapped or vowels being commonly swapped. But that would only apply to records that are in Norwegian. As they're being swapped into English, unfortunately, the trends are not nearly as consistent. But there were a lot of records created in Norwegian in the United States by churches. If it was a Norwegian Lutheran church, many of their early records were created in Norwegian. And if you're trying to determine whether or not they were thinking in Norwegian versus thinking in Norwegian, take a look at the column headings at the top of the parish register. If it is in Norwegian, they were making the records using the Norwegian alphabet more than likely, as opposed to an English alphabet. So families did have to make some spelling choices when they were transitioning into the English language once they arrived here in the United States. This farm name, Bjorn, was a name that was used by a family who moved to south central Wisconsin in the 1840s. And over the next 50 years after they arrived here, their family name was spelled in a wide assortment of ways on different records. There are 34 examples of how that name was spelled here in Wisconsin after they arrived. And generally, when we're looking at transitions into English, there were two things that they were trying to accommodate. And one of those was the fact that there are vowels in Norwegian that don't exist in English. And the other was trying to reconcile English spelling with Norwegian pronunciation. And so the ones here that I have highlighted in red are clearly an attempt to deal with the fact that the letter O, that A with a circle over it, does not exist in English. So they're using the B, they're using the J, they're using the N, and they're cramming a whole wide assortment of vowels in between there to try to equate that Bjorn pronunciation without using that Norwegian vowel. And then these 5 examples are clearly they're trying to use an English spelling phonetically to get that Bjorn pronunciation. So this is to appeal to an English reading audience. They're trying to use those English letters, English pronunciation to get that same sound that they would have in Norwegian. Now, these examples here all include the letter R. Now, the word Bjorn does not have an R in it. And when I say it, I don't hear an R being pronounced, but to somebody's ears, clearly it sounded like there should be an R. Now, I don't know if that was somebody who didn't speak Norwegian and was trying to hear a Norwegian speaker say that word and trying to figure out how it would be spelled. I don't know if it was another Norwegian speaker, but from a different part of Norway where the dialect was really different, thinking, oh yeah, an R belongs in that word. But we can see that was a relatively common occurrence since there are 5 examples that include the letter R. And then a couple here that I wanted to point out is when I was talking about telemark earlier and how sometimes they would add an EN to the end of the word. Here we see it with Bjornen and Bjornen, 2 different spellings, but in both cases they've added an EN or an IN to it. Now the family did settle on a spelling. Eventually they did settle on Bjorn, B-J-O-I-N. And one of the things that I find kind of interesting about the way that they settled on this spelling is that the pronunciation is the same, but they also maintained that J. In English, a J does not make a yes sound. But here, the family has managed to maintain the integrity of that Norwegian pronunciation, including the letter, some of the spelling with that letter J. And I think my personal hypothesis is that this has been allowed to persist because of the just extremely large prevalence of Norwegian speakers in the neighborhood where they lived, where this didn't seem foreign. It didn't seem weird to them. They were able to maintain that BJ being pronounced as Bia. So hopefully this will help you navigate some of the spelling variety in Norwegian language records in Norway and in the United States. And certainly being able to speak Norwegian definitely makes it easier. But you don't necessarily have to be able to speak and read Norwegian in order to anticipate some of the spelling changes. There are many people who are completely unfamiliar with the Norwegian language who've been able to successfully wade through records and books and other sources that are in Norwegian and be able to build their family trees. If you do have other questions for us, you can definitely contact us. I've got our email address up here and a phone number. And we have other webinars on our website. If you'd be interested in learning about some other topics, you can check those out. And I just wanted to thank you once again for joining me and giving me the opportunity to share this information about Norwegian genealogy with you.